Hey everybody, thank you for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John Anders, and today with me I have Pedro Gonzalez. So Pedro is a writer here on Substack, and he's been published in a number of other major publications. And he's somebody I had on because I tend to like to have people who are a little bit idiosyncratic, and people who don't fall easily into one camp or another, and have something a little bit more than just off the shelf to say. And Pedro is somebody who I feel really checks all those boxes. So, Pedro, I'd like to say first of all, thanks for coming on the show, and for some of my readers who are, I guess, listeners who might not be aware of you. Do you want to give a brief rundown on yourself and your writing and your beat, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me on. And where to begin? I guess I started off at least my writing career as kind of like a conservative commentary guy, and then I shifted more into like investigative journalism and things like that. And now I sort of just do what I want. I mostly do like ghostwriting these days and like a lot of freelance work. I'm lucky enough that I can support myself actually as a writer, and Substack's nice because it supplements that. But kind of like what you said at the beginning, I think idiosyncratic or idiotic is the right word, because I really don't feel like I belong to any camp. And I think that sounds really cliche, right? Like it sounds beaten to death. And usually when someone says I don't belong to any camp, it's usually followed with you've never met someone like me before, like you've never had to deal with someone like
I'm not like the other political commentators.
I'm not like the other political commentators who has made being jaded his entire personality. But it is genuinely how I feel, and it's partly due to just a lot of reflection and reflecting on my time in the space, the media market, whatever you want to call it, the circus. And also just, I guess you could say, a lot of my personal experiences with it, professional and personal experiences combined, have led me to the conclusion that this is just, I don't really want to throw a flag up with either side. And in fact, if possible, I would like to encourage people to do what I'm trying to do, which is to get out. I don't know who that, I don't know exactly what the market is for that, so to speak, but like at least for my readers, I often try to tell them, like, you should care about things like children's books, and you should remember that a lot of these things that your favorite talking head tells you is so important, and this is the most important election ever. It is ephemeral, and it will pass, and it will not matter, and you will get older, and you'll look back and you'll wonder why you wasted time on these things that ultimately didn't matter a whole lot.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, because I remember not too long ago I had it was just a random dream where I was like, scrolling on Substack. And it's like, that was the closest I ever came to just like deleting it and leaving right away. Because like, ooh, I don't know if I don't want to look back and be like, yep, I spent all this time on the internet. That having been said, I think there is a there. And I think because I feel the same way, and that's part of what drew me to your writing and digging more into you, because I'm kind of the same way. Like it was the cliche term when I first joined Substack about a year and a half ago was heterodox, right? Which was very much like, I joked, it's like I'm not like the other girls of political ideologies.
Yeah.
That having been said, I think it's something that in a way I feel like it's almost like the new centrist, because, and I don't mean that disparagingly to heterodox or centrist, just in the sense that like up until like 2015 I called myself a centrist just because I didn't have a very good like political or cultural education, I think. And I was like, well, I'm for gay marriage and also for gun rights, so I guess I'm in the middle. And I feel like a lot of people glommed onto centrist and still do, or glom onto heterodox, because I don't think the vast majority of people you can easily put into blue camp or red camp. So I think that's part of what drew me to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the feeling's mutual. I'm surprised actually, because I don't know. I think just because of who I saw you occasionally associating with on Substack, I was like, oh, this person's like part of the the new right. And I use that term because there are so many different factions on the right, and oftentimes these factions resist categorization. And my response is, no, you're part of the new right.
Mhm.
It's a very big group, often with disparate views, often with violently contradictory views, whatever. But it's basically this right that has emerged, which also includes people who are not orthodox, conventional rightists, that has largely emerged with the advent of Donald Trump in 2015. And you mentioned in a DM, when you slid into my DMs, that you were a Bernard brother in the past,
Mhm.
and I made the terrible mistake of once describing myself as such on a national TV program, and people read a lot into that. They were like, once I had like my falling out with the new right, people like dug up the clip. It was Tucker Carlson's now defunct
Mhm.
Fox News hour long. I think it's called Tucker Carlson Today. And I said, yeah, like, I like Bernie. And when I fell out with the new right, their best sleuths dug that clip up as if it was like hidden in the like a lost archive somewhere, and we're like, see, he was never one of us. And it's just funny because, first of all, when I said that I was what I meant is that I liked the way that Bernie Sanders talked about Wall Street versus Main Street, which is also why it made it easy for me to like Trump and hate Hillary Clinton, because Trump and Bernie, they were both dissidents within their own parties. They both said things that broke the orthodoxy of party line. At back then, this is 2015, um, and they were both sort of raging against the system. You could say that they're both raging with the system now. But that that unconventional background of mine is what drew me initially to the new right, and we're going to get into all that stuff. But anyways, like I said, when I saw you on Substack, I was like, okay, this person must belong to that very, very big, sometimes big. It can also get really small very fast. Tent that is the new right. So when you told me that a little bit more about your background, I was pleasantly surprised, because I was like, oh, this person is actually a lot like me. You don't happen to be from California too, do you?
No, I'm from the Midwest.
Okay.
Either where you now reside, I believe.
Yeah, I live in Ohio, but I'm from San Diego. I was born and raised in San Diego, and I lived there all my life until 2019.
Hmm. No, and that makes sense. And I think as I probably don't have to tell you, when you're I hesitate to call myself a public figure because I'm not, I don't have a huge account. But when anytime you're any sort of public figure, you kind of are what people think you are and what people perceive you as. And that's not totally wrong. There's a lot of the new right stuff that I found interesting at the time, and I still find interesting, and we can get into that in a little bit. But I've been, even at the time when I talked to people I was friends with, and some of whom I still am, I was very open. Like, yeah, I guess I sometimes call myself like, like a blue dog Democrat, like Union Midwestern Democrat type.
Yeah.
And like, there's a lot of those people who went for Bernie and then went for Trump. And, personally, I didn't vote for Trump. I didn't, I was, I don't know how much we want to dig into that, but I was like, I just I don't trust this guy necessarily. But that having been said, like I was always I kind of felt like I was the odd man out in those situations, which is kind of, often the case in my life, much in the same way where when I was in like the Bernie bro socialist new left or old left, whatever that movement was called, like I was always very uncomfortable with like the identity politics stuff, and like the more strong excesses of say like the gender ideology movement, like a lot of the base stuff, I was like, okay, this makes sense, let people do their thing. But I think a lot of people feel like that, where you're not strongly in one camp or the other. But you're not 100% wrong. It felt like there was a time where that world was interesting and there was a lot going on there, especially pre the second Trump administration, because a lot of it was like the Democratic Party particularly, the Biden administration was kind of laughable, kind of a joke, and it was fun to, even to this day, it's fun to dunk on the libs. That having been said, after Trump was actually elected the second time, I think that was like one of our first like major interactions on Substack. It's like, I was startled to the degree of the speed to which I saw, Trump betraying so much of what he ran on and so much of like, what his base wanted. And you're seeing, now some of them are still very on board, but a lot of them are already off board and criticizing him. And I guess that kind of, that leads into how I first found out about you. Is there's that whole debacle when, I thought it was interesting because I heard about you originally because you were on Alex Kashuda, and I listened to that episode, and I thought, this is a guy I agree with on some things, I disagree with on others, but you seem like a reasonable, measured guy. And then like I listened to the podcast that you did with Alex Kashuda, where you both were, kind of feeling like it sounds like a lot of people in the Trump base were, and not that you're necessarily Trump based, but in that new right space, like, hey, this isn't what I signed up for. And it seems like, because you seem like a really measured, thoughtful guy, because I read a lot of your stuff, listened to a lot of your podcast, and it seems like you two were just blowing off steam. And same thing with Alex Kashuda. I went on her show once. Alex was very kind to me, and we had a very thoughtful conversation. But like the pushback and backlash was just kind of so insane and disproportionate, and that's kind of what put you on my radar, so to speak. So I guess, what was your experience with that? Like, you don't have to relitigate every single aspect of it, but to me it seems like, in a way, like not so different from like leftist cancel culture when I was in that world. Like you were good, you slightly stepped out of line, and now you're persona non grata.
Yeah. Well, fortunately for me, at that point, this is pretty recent, I didn't care at all. I'd already been canceled, I guess. And Alex was in a very similar position where like she's focused on her family and real life things in Romania where she lives. And so she really, I obviously defended her vigorously during that whole debacle, but like Alex is very, very much like assured in her position, and she's a very strong person.
She seems to have a thick skin.
She's very tough, very thick skin, which is funny because she has a thicker skin than a lot of the men who are attacking her. Which again, it's like it's just true. Like, but okay. So to back up, that we did a podcast about what at the time was the most frustrating thing with the Trump administration, which was the imposition of the tariffs. Not only the imposition with the tariffs, but also there was like this coordinated messaging that was happening, and who knows like to what degree it was actually coordinated from like an actual political organization or whatever. But basically the messaging, and you actually have seen this since then with like a variety. Basically whenever there's an issue that on its face is just like indefensible, like whether it's a betrayal or a policy item, like the most recent one is that the Trump administration is moving to undo a plan that had been implemented by the Biden administration to basically guarantee that like if you're on a flight and the carrier does something that results in a disruption that delays your flight, the carrier has to compensate you. Has to provide cash compensation as opposed to just like credits for so that you're basically locked into using them. And the Trump administration just is moving to undo that, so that if your carrier does something that results in your travel being disrupted, they do not have to compensate you for that. And it's like, and you can almost always expect there to be like a very focused messaging from a cast of characters, anonymous and otherwise, who will tell you, A, it's not happening, then B, it is, but it's not a big deal, and then C, finally, the last stage, it's funny that it's happening to you. And this happened with tariffs. And I saw, I'm sorry, I don't know how want me to name names, but basically there were a lot of like high profile new right figures who were like joking about how the economy was starting to get really nasty, that it was becoming, suddenly it looked like it was going to be a lot harder to retire in the near future. that people were going to lose their jobs, that businesses were going to close due to tariffs. Like all these things at the time were like speculative, and there was a lot of fear. I don't think basically Kashuda was completely vindicated in saying what she said on the podcast, which is that like these tariffs and the economic policies of the administration are going to hurt Main Street the most, which is totally true. At the time, this is back in like April. And so it was up for debate then. It's not up for debate anymore. Like every day, like every day there's a story about like farmers begging the federal government for relief because they're getting killed and stuff. And anyways, but at the time there was the messaging machine was in full swing, and you had people saying stuff like, like these are new right figures who were saying things like, this is funny. And if you lose your job or you can't afford groceries, well, fuck you. Because basically I got what I voted for, which is who fucking knows in the minds of these people. Like I honestly think a lot of these people are doing it for free. They're just like psychopaths. But amid that cacophony of bullshit, Alex and I sat down for a podcast and we're like, we're ashamed to have been in part of this movement. That we're at least that's essentially what I said, and Alex pretty much said that as well. That like this is like, I can't believe we were ever part of this. Like this is it's not just a joke. It's actually evil. Like the reveling in cruelty, not just directed at the libs, but basically anyone, including like Trump voters who protest the policy of the administration. Like, haha, I'm glad this is happening to you because you fucking deserve it, you stupid chud. Also, the chuds are the good guys, and it's like this like schizophrenic switching between. We're for the little guy. Also, we think it's funny when the little guy gets his neck stepped on, because that also means the libs are getting stepped on. Like it's like, it was just. I mean, like I had felt this way for a long time, but it was the first time I'd ever like sat down with someone else who felt that way, and we talked about it. And then I mean, I think that the contents of the podcast were a lot more moderate and measured than my summary of it just now. But then the backlash was insane. Like it was all of these mostly new right men, maybe like one or two females that I saw, but like mostly new right men who were like freaking out. And then the New York Times reported on our conversation. They just had like a quick blurb about it. And then like that took it to the next level. The screaming from the men approached the level of hysteria. Like they were saying that Alex gave the enemy ammunition with which they would like use to kill their families and like dox them and destroy them. And I was just like, you sound like such pussies. Like you're freaking, like you're screaming at the top of your lungs because two people did a podcast that you say no one listens to and talked about how like, these objectively nasty things are nasty, and now you're screaming at the top of your lungs that Alex Kashuda has somehow like stabbed you in the back and potentially like damned your family or something. Like it was insane. That was in April.
And because it's interesting because like I listened to your podcast that you did solo with her, and I think it was 2022 a while back. So I re-listened to that and the one you did with Alex in April, I believe it was. And that's kind of what struck me. A couple things that struck me was first and foremost, like at least, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. You weren't saying like, hey, I am totally going back on everything I said in the past. These elements weren't, the performative cruelty and all that was something you were speaking out against, but it felt like relatively measured to me, and like the numbers were decent, but it wasn't like I mean I have a little bit of insight of like rough ratio of likes to views, so it got good numbers, but like you would think it would be like the hundreds of thousands for the amount of discourse that it got.
Oh my God, yeah.
And also like, because my thought is like, did people actually listen to it, or did they just hear somebody else talk about it? Or what was it like? What was that, super lib chick, Taylor Lorenz, or somebody like that wrote about it? Somebody.
No, it was our podcast was picked up by Michelle Goldberg at the New York Times.
That was it,
and like, and you're right. it was far more moderate than my summary right now, because I just care even less now than I did in April. But it was also like, it was infuriating because most of it, I don't know why, because she was on my show, but most of the hate was directed at her. And it was very personal. It was like, there were comments from people like, oh, Alex got called fat and ugly one time by someone in the new right and she couldn't handle it. Like, that was actually a lot of comments were really personal like that. Like, oh, she got old and she hit the wall and now she feels like she's not, like, it's just like stupid shit like that. That you're right. It's like, you obviously didn't listen to the podcast. Like, this is just sort of like you waiting for an excuse to pick a bone with like a rival or with someone who, stepped out of line or whatever, which goes back to what you were alluding to earlier with like, the behavior was very reminiscent of like left-wing cancel culture, except it was coming entirely from the right. And it was absolutely insane. And the goal is always to just sort of poison the well for someone and discredit them, so that, in an attempt to make it so that no one listens to them or takes them seriously anymore. But the problem is that neither Alex nor I cared about that, so there's no like, your career is over. It's like, we're like, well, we don't think of ourselves as having careers in this space. But anyways, it was disproportionately directed at her. It was extremely vicious, extremely personal, far more vicious and intense than anything we said on the podcast, especially given the subject matter. Like you can read, I had a write-up for the podcast, and I have like the tweets from people in that post where you can see what people were saying about like normal Americans getting screwed by the policies of the administration. And
Yeah. Well, I guess that's kind of what I found interesting about it, because I generally listen to, a lot of what Alex does. And like, I think I probably went on around the time of her turn, just because, that's kind of what I said in mine. It's like, it's some interesting ideas, but you still have to live in the real world, measured or against like your real life experiences. Don't be a terminally online weirdo. And to me, that's kind of what I found kind of interesting and puzzling about the whole situation. And, I don't want to dwell on it too much, since it sounds like, it was not a pleasant experience for you or her. That having been said, I feel like it's kind of very telling of like online movements in general, and kind of the moment we're at right now culturally, because I remember seeing very similar things when I was more in like leftist online spaces. I remember seeing kind of the same thing, like when the protests and or riots, depending on your disposition, in 2020, like, people like, that you've probably seen the same discourse of like, okay, they're burning down and destroying their own neighborhoods and destroying these businesses. Like, well, they have insurance and stuff, which
right,
maybe
yeah.
fair enough. But like, there's a lot of small businesses, like, oh, well, fuck small business owners, because they're, those were, if you read your history, that fascism's biggest support base was the middle class. So actually, you're doing praxis by, fucking over the middle class, and it's okay to steal from small businesses because they're probably racist anyway. And it's like, to me, like, and this is maybe like a better lead into the larger question, like, I understand, I think, and if you want to expand on it a little bit more, because I don't think it was like, it sounds like you're pretty disillusioned before this fact. And I think you've articulated it well. And if you want to expand on it more, go ahead. I understand like what pushed you away from it, but I'm curious to what drew you towards, the Trump movement initially, and conservatism. Because again, it sounds like you're kind of a little bit more free floating. And at least from what I've read of you, you seem like you're somebody who's ideologically consistent. And when the territory changes, you update your map, so to speak. But I saw a lot of people who are really, stuck in one ideological camp, who are not willing to like acknowledge when there are changes. And that's kind of what I experienced more on the left. So I'm curious what drew you to that initially. And for a little bit of context, I found part of the new right stuff interesting initially, and some of it I still do find interesting, say, your Curtis Yarvins or whatnot, because I think I heard about him in like 2018 because I was in, I'm a weirdo who's in online politics spaces, and I saw somebody
Yeah.
talking about monarchism. I was like, you're trolling. That's not a real thing. I was like, no, this is a real thing. Look at this guy. And just kind of followed it passively at first. And I was like, okay, this is kind of interesting in an intellectual sense. And I started seeing more and more stuff about how people in, the what was to be the next Trump administration um, were following him, like, JD Vance being influenced by him, Peter Thiel and the PayPal Mafia, all these guys. And at least to me, like I said, the first time around, I was a Bernie Sanders guy. I didn't vote for Trump the second time around, but it's like, at the very least, like the working class coalition, that's something that can be picked up. I think directionally when people talk about the need to reindustrialize or rebalance global trade or just kind of dealing with the fact that, we're a multipolar world now and the US can't just, throw around its weight, and maybe we do need to retrench and focus on the homeland. I was like, okay, if they do that, that'll be great. I was not sold on it, and I was kind of vindicated in that because, as far as I'm concerned, so far, like the second Trump administration has been like George Bush part 4, I guess, if you count his dad and both of his other terms. So I'm curious because I'm curious what drew it to you. What drew you to it initially? I guess.
I'll get to that, but I was desperately holding on to something you said so I don't forget it.
Yeah, go ahead.
During the riots in 2020, you made this great point about how the left actually rationalized how normal people, the middle class, the small business owner was getting hurt. And whereas at the same time, the same people would often think of themselves and speak of themselves as allies to the little guy versus, the corporations, the oligarchs, whatever. But what you saw in that moment was this kind of rationalization that reduced basically an inconvenient person or group of people into kind of an abstraction, dehumanizing them and then turning them into this thing that is no longer really a person, but more of like an idea that joins this cloud that's floating above us that is comprised of all of the bad, like, white supremacy, sexism, homophobia, whatever. Like in this moment, that group of people was sort of linked with this big amorphous, like I said, cloud of evildoers, right? And you saw the right do the same thing to thankfully a lesser degree in the beginning of the administration with these policies. Like when the stories were coming out of there was a story about a woman and a veteran who were laid off by the Trump administration despite having like very good performance records. I forget which agency they worked at, but they got caught up basically in the Doge cuts. And both of them again said that, they voted for Trump, that they voted for him because they thought he was going to turn things around. And unfortunately, they got a lot of like shit online because it was like, well, you got what you voted for. You voted for Trump, who said he was going to shrink the government, and then you lost your job. Congratulations. And I always think that sort of thing is really nasty and not productive at all. Like, especially if you're trying to, win someone over or give them like an off ramp. But it wasn't just the left saying that. It was also the right. Like I also saw a lot of people, and like when I wrote about it and when I tweeted about it, the replies I got were good. Government parasites on employees, and I'm like, no, they're not government parasites. They're your neighbors. They voted for Trump for the same reasons that you did. They just happen to have government jobs, and they got caught up in these like unfair layoffs. Like I think Doge is an abject disaster. And it basically turned the federal government into Elon Musk's personal data mine and Palantir's like plaything. But this exact same thing happened. The individuals who were hurt by these policies, they ceased to be individuals and they were reduced to abstractions. And they ceased to be human, and they just became part of this this big cloud of enemies, government parasites, communists, like Marxists, whatever. And it's like, no, they're your neighbors who have Trump flags on their porches, just like you. And you're right. It was so reminiscent of the riots in 2020, where anyone who was sort of like on the wrong side of history at that moment in time kind of ceased to be a person. And there was almost no limit to the harm that you could do to them, whether it's destroying their business or like, actually attacking them, whatever. I saw a very similar thing from the new right. And it was being rational. That behavior was given license to by some of like the biggest voices on the new right. And yeah, so I didn't put up with it when I saw it from the left, and I wasn't going to put up with it when I saw it from the right. And we're working or backing our way into what attracted me to the right. This is part of why, like, I ultimately just couldn't belong to any team, right? I was not going to just like be quiet ever at any when it comes to stuff like this. And I think the idea of like no enemies to the right, first of all, that's bullshit. Second of all, it's stupid. Like, no one who says no enemies to the right actually believes in that. And second of all, the result, the actual what that looks like in practice, the praxis of no enemies to the right is being like, dude, you can't criticize so and so for saying that it's funny that like farmers are getting crushed, or that like, so and so lost their job because of these stupid policies. Like, you can't punch right. You can't say, like, how is like lame is that? Like, are you like a high school like girl or something? I don't know. Like, what kind of walk me through the steps that it takes to think like that. You can't comment on this abject, terrible thing that's happening because, dude, you'll like, you just don't do that. It's like bro code, man. It is so pathetic and ironically so effeminate. And it comes from a movement that thinks of itself as like so masculine and like individualistic and Nietzschean, right? And it's a joke. Anyways, what attracted me to the right was initially its open-mindedness, which is the opposite of everything that I just talked about for the last like 3 minutes. It was open and it was willing to tolerate people that were unorthodox. I remember vividly getting into like really vicious arguments with friends who were like more liberal and left-leaning, who were just totally intolerant of anything that violated their worldview, and down to like, it's so crazy how it mirrors everything the right has become. Like, if I sent them an article from a website like Fox News or whatever, obviously Fox News is fake news to them, which they were like the ones saying fake news before the right was.
A lot of people don't remember that.
Yeah, I would get that. I would get that response like, no, that's Fox News. I'm like, what do you mean it's Fox? Well, it would be something that's just like objectively true, right? It's not like an op-ed or something. That's just like a news reporter, whatever. That's like being undercovered in like liberal media, whatever. Or Fox News was like the first thing that came up, and the answer I got was like, well, that's not a good source. It's Fox News. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean it's not? It's true regardless of where it comes from. And the answer it was always so like smug and like self-satisfied that like I didn't understand that I was like a victim of like the fake news narrative. These are people who were on the left in like 2015, like telling me that like I needed to support Hillary Clinton, and if I didn't, then I was just like totally brainwashed by like the conservative establishment or whatever. And I was like, at the time, like I said, I was like I liked the things that Bernie said, and I had some conservative views and some liberal views, like I still do today, I guess. But then my friends who were on the right, and including friends who back then I would consider like hard right, were never like that. They were always very open-minded. They never were cruel to me when I disagreed with them. They were always willing to like, agree to disagree. Well, if you want to know more, check out this book, or like, here's this article, I'm like, let's go hang out. But my friends on the left were very vicious and closed off. And it was like, once you crossed the line with them, it was like, you were not really friends anymore. And then, almost a decade later, it's completely reversed. And now it feels like the right is doing all of this. So,
yeah, I wonder if that's a function of, when you're in power, then you're like, if you're, what do you call that? Like, I'm trying to think, like, it's easier to be like, yeah, why would you make any concessions when you're in power. But, when you're on the up and up, when you're not in power, you have that luxury. So, which I guess I understand from like a realpolitik standpoint. But it is very frustrating to see, I kind of felt the same way when I was like, more on the left. I was like, hey, aren't we supposed to be the open-minded ones? Aren't we supposed to be more tolerant, trying to see things from lots of points of views? But now that the right is ascendant and the left is descendant, I think those roles have kind of reversed. And I guess to a certain degree, I think it's just kind of an unfortunate function of how power politics works.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I actually don't know, because it's not strictly political. It's also cultural.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that is worth noting is a lot of the people who I knew early on who were part of the right eventually found their way out. And they either completely disengaged from politics for very similar reasons, but just much earlier on than I did. And they went on to do things that are not political at all. They started families. They got out. And I think about that a lot, that I wonder, what did they see that I didn't see early on? And, why didn't they tell me? No, but I'm not sure how this happens. This kind of, it's probably a very similar dynamic, like once you feel like you're culturally ascendant, that now you're sort of setting the ground rules and you get to decide. I mean, you can hear this directly from people on the right, how they talk and how they kind of take it upon themselves to police what people say and think, down to like the music that is okay. What is and is not, down to what is and is not Kino, right?
Instead of problematic, it's like, oh, it's cringed or based.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. It's, instead of a movie being problematic, it's cringe. And it's just insufferable. And I just came to the conclusion in a very belated fashion that like it would be such a tragedy to live your life like this. And it would be such a tragedy to live your life under the sway of people that tell you, what you are allowed to like and think and say, and how you're allowed to like and think and say things. And I just, it just, unfortunately, it took me, 8 years, just about.
Yeah, I guess to a certain degree, like, it's banal to say, but like that's the nature of these online echo chambers. Because I remember hearing and feeling very vindicated initially by, I could name names, but just saying like off the type of conversation that you and Alex had with like former leftist people who aren't even like wow, I'm going full right wing now. It's like, wow, this cancel culture shit's pretty crazy, huh? And if like, yeah, I know it is, right? And there was a lot of the times a similar reaction, but it does feel like there is a sea change in the culture, which I think you mentioned, and I think hits the nail on the head pretty well. And it does seem like there is a general shift to the right. I think a lot of the people on the right are maybe a little bit too triumphalist with it. I've said before that I think the vibe shift is real, but it's an ongoing thing. You're on the top of the wheel right now. I don't know if that's going to be the case in even another couple years, but I guess I'm wondering what you think, what they got right, or is there anything you still stand by? Because just to play devil's advocate, right off the top of my head, two people who are critical of, and I don't want to dwell on this too much, but this is part of the larger point. Like, I remember somebody like Dudley Newright, who gave some, I think, some pretty respectful pushback, or librarian of Colino, however you pronounce that. And I think from what I saw, your response is pretty measured to them. You went on Dudley's podcast, so I feel like there is a there with the more like broad trend towards conservatism, right wing, whatever you want to call it, or at least the move away from like the hyper liberalism. And I don't mean necessarily liberalism as in gay marriage, Although I don't not mean that, but I mean liberalism is like that hyper individualistic, market value, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like there's a broader shift away from that in the culture across the board. So all that to say, like, is there things about that you still think have value, and it was just like the online weirdos that were a problem that like became too much for you?
But I wouldn't say it's the, I mean, it's the administration itself. It's this
Oh,
movement.
yeah, sure.
It's not relegated. I wish it was relegated to being online, but I mean, the fish rots from the head down, right? And the reason that the online right is as insane as it is, and is the way it is because, well, that's it. The cult of personality has a figure at the center of it, and his cult will, resemble him. I'm using that like in the actual classical sense of the term. I don't mean like, Scientology or whatever. It very much is a kind of old-fashioned political cult of personality. And Trump is very charismatic, very chaotic, I think very kind of dark. It's interesting that there was this big rise in like occultism on the right that I think accompanied Trump's presence on the political stage. There's actually been whole books written about it. I'm not sure why, but there's this very kind of strange vibe about the movement. And you kind of catch this occasionally from the right when they talk about things like meme magic. I don't know if you remember these meme. Okay,
well, it's QAnon has a very occult vibe.
Yes. Well, and Trump leaned into QAnon. I mean, like I've written. I don't know if I published it. I was working on a big piece about this, but especially in his campaign for the second administration, he completely leaned into QAnon. Like he was like retweeting QAnon or retruthing QAnon posts. Like his rallies were invoking themes that are just it's not really up for debate. Like these are things that are taken from, and who knows who was behind it, but it was very intentional. Like the rally he had in Waco, Waco, Texas, that was built around honoring, like basically making it seem like J6 was like a great, thing that happened, and we should never sort of cast any kind of shame on that. Like my initial reaction to J6s is like, you can find my tweet. I said something like, "This is stupid. It's going to be used against the right like a noose, and the only people this helps is the Democratic Party." And that I like that. My argument was like, I think this is like it before things got really crazy. I was like, this is basically kind of a trap. Anyways, I'm not sure how we got here. Oh yeah, the online weirdos. The online weirdos are just they are just a symptom of the cause. And the cause is the Donald. But no, I think the shift that is happening is both understandable and inevitable, and not entirely bad. I don't think that the cultural shift is like liberals, and some liberals, try not to speak in wildly broad generalizations. Some liberals are obviously freaking out. It's funny because they're kind of doubling down on all the things that are causing it. Like young men are more right leaning than like previous generations for obvious reasons. Like they grew up under the heel of the worst excesses of feminism. I don't mean like, the feminism of like, be nice to women or whatever. It's like the feminism of the world would be better if we only had women, and all the men were like just completely denuded of masculinity and oppressed and reminded that everything bad that has ever happened and will happen is their fault. Like millennials complain because, we got it, but Gen Z got the worst of it. Like they grew up under a system that was designed to make them hate themselves for being born men. And like not be represented. It's funny because we often make fun of like liberals and leftists for using terms like representation, but there's actually kind of truth to it. And it's funny because the right will validate that when it complains about how it's like, well, there's the reason young men are not, for example, reading like young adult like fiction or novels anymore, period, is because they don't feel like the stories resonate with them because they don't feel represented in these stories, right? And so it's understandable that it's happening. And of course, you have some people on the left, some liberals who are, their response to it is like, what is wrong with you? You know, this
Mhm.
is like, why are you doing this? You're doing this because you're bad and I hate you. And it's like, okay, well, you're going to get more of it now. So, and it's not just men, it's obviously there is some shifts underway with girls and young women too. And I think, like, again, I think all that stuff is for the most part good. Um, Obviously there could be an overcorrection. I don't think there will be, although there are people on the new right who kind of like, they like to post things like the left has no idea that it's in danger, and like Gen Z is gonna like form like death squads and like
Mhm.
it's really pathetic when you think about the fact that the people that are posting that are like middle-aged men, fantasizing about young
Yeah.
men. It's like middle-aged men fantasizing about young men killing the liberals, you know, it like or like oppressing the liberals, and it's like it's really fucking pathetic.
Well, I don't want
And
to.
yeah,
Well, I don't want to like put too fine of a point on this, but interestingly enough, Crystal Ball of Breaking Points was recently on. I don't know if this is on your radar. Joshua Citarella on Substack and other platforms has a show where he has like various like lefty people on, and she made a similar point of like, and I've heard other people on the left like Amber Frost, for example. There's just like this fetishization of youth that exists on the left. But
yes,
clearly it's
yes,
not exclusive to the left of the youth will save us. If you're looking at these online trends that may or may not be indicative of something larger, because at least to me, and I'm curious to your thoughts on this, to me, like, it feels like I really do think like the vibe shift is ongoing thing. Like, it's the if trends continue fallacy as always. Like, yes, they're trend. I think Donald Trump was very thermostatic, and much in the same way that like I hear a lot of people on the left like Zoran Mamdani is the future of the Democratic Party. It's like, to me, like, I have not looked into this guy super deeply because I don't live in New York, and I make a point of like national level or local. Like, I don't try to get too invested in local politics of places that I don't live. But like, it seems like he's like a Bernie crat. There's not something that is particularly like interesting or exciting about him. I feel like it's probably very thermostatic because at least my understanding is New York had a lot of shitty, corrupt politicians. Surprise, surprise. So they're willing to try something new, and that's something I do think. Like I said at the time too, like, guys, like, you can't. It's one of those things like, okay, so you had this historic victory in 2024 because for a lot of reasons, but I think part of it was like, while people were annoyed with the cultural liberalism of like being an annoying nag who like forces your worldview on everybody else, even when like that's only popular to like, I would say, like, if you're being the most generous, like 30% of the population, it's like, oh, we took power, let's do the same thing, and we'll just assume people will get behind it. So I do feel like the vibe shift is something that's going to be continuing to happen, but it does feel like it's going a little bit more conservative. So,
yeah,
what are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's going to be like another big thermostatic shift? Because I've talked about like, and I'm not the only person, like, I see like Democrats either doing in 2028, like either doing the same thing and being like Trump was a fluke, or doing blue MAGA, because at this point, like, I can't tell who is going to be worse off in 2028,
yeah,
like Republicans without woke or Democrats without MAGA.
yeah, yeah. I'm the very. I feel the same way that you do. I don't feel like these proclamations of absolute certainty are really built on anything other than sand right now.
Mm-hmm.
And
Vibes.
yes, it's a lot of vibes and wish casting.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the people, or at least some of them, who are now dreaming about the day that young Gen Z men form death squads, were also just a few years ago saying that woke is here to stay for like the foreseeable future. And I recently came across an article. I don't remember where it was or who it was by. I really quickly put it out of mind because of the contents. It was basically this very apocalyptic opinion piece about how America was like sleepwalking into a long dark age of woke. And basically it made it seem as if there was no light and that things were just going to continue to get worse because also the population is just not what it used to be, and it will roll over and it will accept slavery over freedom. And I just kind of like laughed to myself and closed it. And there's a lot of stuff like this. You can read articles like that from like 2 years ago as if nothing could ever be different. And I'm not saying that, you know, well, aren't you glad that Trump got elected? And that it's like, no, I think that Trump's election was a symptom of that, not necessarily the cause of the, like the vibe shift helped Trump win. And the vibe shift was the result of just living under this oppressive boot of whatever you want to call it, like late stage liberalism. I hate the term woke actually. Like I think it's such a stupid, lazy term.
Me too. But
yeah.
I think it's a useful term because I think it's something that is real. Like I was listening, I don't know if you know, there's a guy, a YouTuber called Flesh Simulator, which is a funny name, but he talked about how like and again, this is what I was talking about with the vibe shift being an ongoing thing between in 2010, Barack Obama said he didn't believe in gay marriage because he was a Christian and that was like wrong morally. In 2020, if you're like, you know,
I mean because he's a Muslim? I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course. So that's right. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
But yeah, in 2020, if you were a Democrat and said, like, you know, I don't know if a child should have puberty blockers, that could be a career ender for you. And I feel like a lot of people, that was part of what was frustrating for me, like on the left, like wouldn't acknowledge, like, wow, that's a really big vibe shift. And I was one of those people who was in these spaces where I heard about these things. So to me, it wasn't totally jarring, but like your average normie, you know, Democrat voter in Michigan, like that's a big vibe shift to them. Much in the same way, I feel like, you know, 2020 to 2005, that's a big difference, you know?
Yeah. And I think that it's really anyone's game. That's why I also don't really get people that are just really confident that, you know, midterms are going to be either a disaster or a sweep for the Republican Party. I really don't know. It could go either way because as bad as the right is, or rather as bad as it is proving at governing, and regardless of the cultural excesses of the new right and how kind of cringe you could say Trump has become, and I think you see this reflected in some corners of the younger right, like there are like hard right or far right or paleo like Zoomers who kind of look at Trump as like washed, and you know they don't really like JD Vance, and so you already kind of see that dissatisfaction growing in some parts of the right, and I have no idea what that's going to translate into politically and where it's going to go. Anyways, I actually not anyways, really quickly, I wrote about a Gen Z kid with a YouTube channel who described himself as basically like an independent who liked things that the Democratic Party said about like economic inequality in this country, but he voted for Trump. I think he's like 23, and he said he voted for Trump because he thought Trump was going to give us hope and change, and that he was making this video to apologize to his audience because he got it wrong. And he said Trump has proven to be like a fraud, and that he, you know, sold me a false bill of goods. And then he listed a number of things. One of them was economic policies, and the other one was the Epstein files. And it's interesting because the Epstein files seems to be like a hot topic among Zoomers, and it seems to like I don't know. Maybe it's because they grew up more so than any other generation, like in that, you know, immersed. I don't want to call it conspiracy theories, but like in that stuff, you know. being
Yeah.
bombarded with like Epstein content and memes, and I don't know, the weird world of the online. But no, so I think that the vibe shift could continue to go in the direction it's going, which is right, or it could stall and end up someplace much more moderate, and which I think would be obviously the best result, because I generally loathe extremes. I hated the extremes of left wing intolerance. I hate the extremes of right wing intolerance. And I don't know if that makes me a centrist in the same way that you said it
Mhm.
made you a centrist, which is like I don't like extremes, and I don't think it's good for the country. But the problem is that like at the same time that you have this administration that's just like fumbling over and over, and like I said, you have the excesses and kind of cringeworthiness of parts of the right culture. Then it's like, okay, what's the alternative? Well, it's a Democratic Party, and they just can't seem to get anything right. And
Mhm.
there'll be some like layup. It'll be like Donald Trump has, you know, fired the woman who's in charge of making sure that corporations don't like crush your skull with their steel toe boot. And then it's like, quick, all right, come up with messaging. And the Democrats are like, can you believe that Donald Trump fired the first black woman to ever hold this position? And it's like,
Yeah.
it's like, this is what everyone hates you. Like the thing that you focused on is that she's like a black woman or whatever, and not that her job was to prevent corporations from crushing your skull with a steel toe boot. And that's why everyone hates you and laughs at you. And
Yeah.
then, yeah, so
No, I don't think you're wrong. I think there's something to be said for that. And again, I don't know who is going to be worse off. Like the metaphor I've used sometimes, like that's why like I'm starting to write about a little bit more. Because you know, despite like, this conversation, and it's been a really great and interesting conversation, like I don't broadly like having this discussion online. Like it's good to have it personally with you, but like,
yeah,
because there's to me like it's kind of like what I was getting at, the metaphor I use is like if you've ever been like, you're 22, you went to a house party, you're really, really drunk, you had, you went too far, and like, all right, I just need to work through this. Like I'm gonna have to like, it's if you've ever been there, like it's a process. You're gonna throw up a lot, you're gonna drink a lot of water, you fall asleep, you wake up. That's kind of what it feels like. And if you're like, no, I just need to drink 6.5 cups of water and then I'll sleep for 2 hours, like the plan's not gonna work. I think it's gonna be thermostatic for a while. And like, because at least to me, like both of the parties are so completely incompetent. Um, but I think there is something to be said for like the cultural trends that underpin it. And that's kind of what I find maybe more interesting, because, whether, culture is downstream of politics or politics is downstream of culture, there's a debate there. But I do feel like there are some interesting things happening culturally. And I kind of wanted to pick your brain on that too, because it sounds like we're on the same page that, it's maybe been all to say, but yeah, it's kind of fucked, and we're gonna have to kind of work through it. Because there are some things that like I do feel a little bit more optimistic for, like I listened to, for example, you talked to Cairo Smith on your podcast, and he was a really interesting guy, and he was talking about the publishing industry and how they only want, which is something I've talked to other authors like Lisa Kuznak, who I had on my podcast, like they want female authors, but not female authors who are not writing about how hard it is to be a woman, or et cetera, et cetera. I think Kyra said something similar. But it feels like to me, because of that, and that's kind of what I'm tying it into with the political parties and these cultural institutions like publishing houses, it feels like they've just completely lost credibility, but there's a lot of energy bubbling underneath, be it in the artistic sense or the political sense, because I feel like a lot of people who are, I think there was some interesting and legitimately thoughtful and worthwhile stuff on the new right. Just like I thought there was like a lot of thoughtful and interesting and worthwhile things in the Bernie left. But like people are like, okay, well, we got you in power and you didn't do the thing you said you're going to do. You did the thing that we've been doing. So all that to say, I feel like there is like an undercurrent of something that is there that the institutions are not supporting or allowing for. So I'm curious to what your thoughts are and like how you can see that going either politically or more specifically culturally, because you've done a lot of interesting cultural writing as well that I feel like there's a lot to still be captured there with institutionals that the energy kind of exists on the ground.
I actually really hope that at some point for example, publishing houses like the larger institutions that run the publishing industry actually catch up with where trends are going, or at least become more open to them. I think indie publishing and self-publishing is great, but I think it's just bad when you have these gigantic enterprises that just don't really care about a big chunk of the population or just are completely out of touch with them. So I think that's one thing that maybe I differ on with other people who are either adjacent to the right or part of the right or whatever, who are just kind of like, well, we need to burn down like, Penguin or whatever. Like I disagree, and like I really hope actually that it eventually opens up or loosens up rather. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting energy and a lot of cool, I guess you could say, content. I wrote about this for Chronicles magazine a few months ago, and I was watching Deadpool and Wolverine, and I remember when I can't remember, is Deadpool and Wolverine the third one in the series or the second one? It's the third one because
It's the third one, I'm pretty sure.
I don't remember if it was the first or the second one, but I remember watching it in theaters and and thinking that it was inappropriate that there was this gag. I don't like Jared Kushner, but there was a gag in the movie where there was a evil character who looked like Jared Kushner. Deadpool referred to him as such, and then at one point he executes him, and like they show everything. Like it's very like, oh yeah, it's like we killed the guy who we had set up as being a stand-in for Jared Kushner, and I was like, that's I don't really like that. And this is like I think 2018 maybe, I don't know, I could be totally wrong, but it was I think I was still like very pro Trump back then, but regardless, I didn't think that was like a good joke. And fast forward, in the latest installment, the butt of a lot of jokes in the movie is this like Deadpool, because there's like multiple Deadpools in this movie because there's like multiple verses, and one of the main Deadpools is like a very effeminate version of Deadpool who has like basically no powers, and he has like a man bun, and he's a vegan, and he's like a feminist, and he's like very, very liberal, and Deadpool makes fun of him for those things. And it just occurred to me that like, that's a pretty interesting switch from, shooting Jared Kushner's lookalike in the face to having like the running gag being this Deadpool sucks because he's like a lib. At one point he's like brutally killed, and like there's no real like sympathy for that character at all, and he's like really like a caricature of like Deadpool if he lived in like Portland or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I like just little things like that, like that I've been noticing over the last, I don't know, 2 years or so. And apart from publishing is one example, and I have more to say about that. But one of the main places that I've actually seen this is in gaming. There have been a number of titles, namely like Helldivers 2 and Space Marine 2, that were wildly successful, and they had this unique formula, which was they were made by people who actually like video games, which is like,
imagine that.
And if you don't know, like there's been a string of absolute bombs. One of the biggest ones being, I think, what was it called? Concord? Yeah, Concord.
Mm-hmm.
Concord was like one of the most expensive games ever developed. It was like, I want to shoot myself in the mouth for saying this. It was hyper woke. It was explicitly like in your face. It was like, we have an ideology and we're going to make a video game around it, kind of a thing. And it was like hundreds of millions of dollars to make, and it was an absolute bomb. Like no one played it. It was so utterly devastated upon release by reviews. I think it was like dead before it was even released. Like it was absolute garbage. And then you have Helldivers 2 and Space Marine 2, and in both of those instances, the studios basically said we just wanted to make something that doesn't really it's something that's just fun. And more so actually in the case of Space Marine 2, that it's funny because the head of the studio actually got like a little bit of backlash for this, because he said, I don't want my game to like have any messaging. I just want it to be like a throwback to the kinds of games that I grew up playing, which is just like hack and slash, smash stuff. And people kind of pushed back on him. I forget, there was an article in some like, mainstream like video game paper saying like, kind of like, well, we all know what that means. No messaging, it's like implicitly like right wing, whatever. But both of those games were really successful. And there's been a number of other video games that are very similar. They're produced by studios that just want to make good stuff that actually kind of honors the art and craft of making something, and also is unafraid of transgressing whatever pieties are in fashion in the given moment for the sake of actually creating something that's beautiful. And I do think that video games can rise to the level of art. I mean, yeah. Anyways, I'll just stop there because I keep going.
No, I think it's interesting you say that, because I want to give a shout out to a friend of the show, Yakubian Ape on Substack. He wrote a really interesting write up on Concord. Who, I think the quote unquote woke aspect, it's very clearly and presently there, but it was also kind of a confluence of so many other things, like the fact that they tried to make it a what do you call it? Like I play a little bit of video games, as we discussed in the DMs. Like, so I'm not a huge gamer, so if I get the terminology wrong, forgive me, gamers. But like, it's the massively on the MMO or whatever you call it, the massive multiplayer shooter, which were like already kind of like they can be kind of loss leaders. Like you spend a lot of money to make them, you make it all back in subscriptions. Which is an already oversaturated market, plus a video game industry that has become just totally bloated, and like there's all this like superfluous consulting and whatnot. So I feel like it's kind of symbolic of where we're at with the culture right now, because I think the quote unquote go woke go broke thing is like, that's true like maybe 50% of the time, and that's
Right.
being really, really generous, because there's a lot of things that are quote unquote woke that become extremely successful. I think more recently, like I saw people on the far right and the far left complaining recently about the recent Superman movie, but what pick what you want. I think these things can still be very successful. That having been said, I feel like it says something to like the institutional bloat. And I had a conversation with, I don't know if you know her, my most recent episode before this one was with Daniela Pentstack, and I kind of said like, whoever can offer a vision of normalcy is going to own the future. And right now, to me, it feels very, very up in the air of who can own who can offer a vision of normalcy and like what it means to be an American in the 21st century. Because sometimes like I will admit, like I can be a little bit doomer, but I think America as an economic entity as well as a culture still has a lot more gas in the tank than people on either the far right or the far left are willing to admit. Because I think you hit the nail on the head very well earlier when you're talking about this. To be a doomer and be like, it's either like we are so back or it's over, to use the memes. Like it's either, it's going to be white genocide / trans concentration
Rwanda.
camps. Yeah. Or, it's going to be like, we're going to have the great white ethno state. We're going to deport all the non-whites, or, fully automated luxury gay space communism. That having been said, and this is kind of leads into like the broader point of like what could be the new American identity versus also like, I will admit like something I'm more conservative / hawkish on is immigration, which is, more right coded, or, to me, it's like, Bernie Sanders said like open borders or a Koch brothers conspiracy. He said that fairly recently. Yeah. To me, like, but I'm not like, wow, I don't want all these, these filthy brown people in my country. It's more like, wow, if you're looking at it on either poles of illegal immigration from South America and Mexico, like these people are being exploited and it's undercutting American labor. And that includes legal immigrants and, anybody who's, grew up here, as well as on the other end of the spectrum, because I work in tech, what affects me, like the H-1B system, where it's basically the exact same thing, where, I talked to a senior software engineer who is from India, an H-1B, who is making $20 an hour. So these people are getting exploited and it's undercutting American labor. So, and I apologize, this is kind of the signature of my show. I ask very long-winded and open-ended questions, but like, what are your thoughts on like, because I know that's something you've talked about, if your thoughts on that have changed, because to me, like, I do believe, as cliche as it is, America is a nation of immigrants. Like if you look at like the 1800s, the Gilded Age, it was much more contentious even than it is now, and we were able to form a cohesive identity of being an American. So I think it is possible to do that again. But it is not a given. And I think there need to be like very mindful steps towards what the new American identity is going to be. And like, the vague, you know, quote unquote woke multiculturalism, I don't think that really tracks, because there needs to be something larger that people aspire to and assimilate into. But also, like, obviously, I feel like, white ethno state is a non-starter as well. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that more broadly? Like, what could be the future of American culture and identity, especially vis-a-vis, because like immigration is probably one of the bigger pain points right now.
God, bro, why are you asking me all these questions? This is like you're asking me to solve the national question right now. No,
If you, it's what I do.
You're like, you called me a filthy brown person, and then you asked me to solve your problems.
I said no such thing.
I'm just kidding. No, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think that I think you're right. America has always been this kind of. Actually, I don't know. I was thinking about this before you called, or before we set up the call, and my mind went back to a book called "Who Are We" by Samuel P. Huntington. Have you read it?
No.
Are you familiar with Huntington at all?
I've heard the name. Tell me.
Okay. Basically, Huntington was trying to address this problem. I think the book was published in 2007, and it was his last major work before he passed. And, this is in the shadow of 9/11. And he is grappling with this problem of what in his mind is a disintegrating national identity. And the book was slightly controversial because Huntington had to just do the factual thing, which is acknowledge that the composition of the United States at its founding was largely white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and that downstream of that you have certain mores and views on the regime type, the nature and role of law and the separation of powers and things like that, and that all of these things are inextricably tied to the founding population, the settler stock, the majority of them. But obviously, the United States is also a nation that, as you said, has long, received waves and waves of migrants who have changed the character of the country in different ways. And so I always think it's kind of funny when people are like, "Well, the Mexican, and my ethnicity is." Hence the poor joke. I apologize for that. You didn't.
That's okay. I get it. I wasn't offended.
No, it's okay. That the Mexicans today are like the Irish of yesteryear or whatever. Not really true. I think that previous waves of immigrants had a much easier, I don't know, much easier time integrating because they came from Europe, and therefore there's a kind of familiarity. There's something like an understanding of a certain way of life. I know I'm being very vague here, but I think you kind of have to be when you're talking about something as complex as this. And immigration today is generally not from Europe. It's from places that have completely different conceptions of the appropriate role of government in public life, different religion, like completely different religions. It's just a very different character of immigration. And I think that it's folly and just frankly untrue to overlook that. And that's not the same thing as what you said. Like, it's not acknowledging those differences is not the same thing as saying I hate brown people. And that's kind of what Huntington was trying to do, was like, yes, America was a nation of, well, he actually does this whole thing where he says America was a nation of settlers, not immigrants. And he explains the difference, which is to say that settlers are people that come from one place to another and they create a new society, whereas immigrants are places who leave one society and then join another society. And his argument is it's inaccurate to say it's a nation of immigrants because the colonists came here to nothing and then created something that then immigrants came to. And that matters because every wave of immigration will change the character of the country. And, hopefully to not such a radical degree that the form of government becomes just totally unrecognizable. And there's an irony here with the right, by the way, and I'm going to try to hold that thought so I can come back to it. But it's a really good book because Huntington really digs deep on, he goes back and he reads the Federalist Papers. There's one by John Jay where John Jay outlines the things that he thinks that Americans are blessed by Providence because God has given them a country that is populated by people who speak, he lists a number of things, speak the same language, common ancestry, common history, specifically talks about their experience fighting, in wars together, common religion, Christianity, specifically Protestantism, and then I think there was a fifth one, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But Huntington goes back and looks, what the actual founders said about how they thought of themselves, and also how they thought about immigration, saying things like we must see, I think there's a quote by Franklin. I think he's talking about Germans, and he says that we have to see them more Americanized. And the reason that Huntington wrote this book is because he obviously, as a scholar, he understands what happens when you get balkanization, when the cohesive character of a country breaks down. Identity does not go away. Identity just is kind of layered. And so you have different tiers of identity. There's, tribe, ethnicity or race, there's culture, there's religion, and then I think at like the highest, most abstract level is like nationality. Who, you think of yourself as an American. When I go to Germany, I often think of this because, I'm Hispanic, I have black hair, olive skin, and I probably look Turkish to a lot of Germans or something. And then they ask me, where are you from? And I say, I'm American. And I'm like, what, it's.
Is it better or worse treatment out of curiosity?
What's that?
Is it better or worse treatment out of curiosity?
I've never encountered anyone like being mean. I know that people will say that Europeans look down on us, whatever. I've never experienced that. Mm-hmm. One time I got carded with my wife. We were going to a bar, and there were these two enormous Ukrainian bouncers at the door, and apparently they don't allow, at this particular bar, they don't allow any Turkish men in because they just don't, they just have a rule, Turkish, basically black hair, you're not allowed in. And they saw my American passport and they looked at the passport, looked at me, they just kept looking at the passport, looking at me, and then the guy gives my passport back and he says, have fun, through this super thick Ukrainian accent. And then we went in, but that I've never had any bad experiences. And generally, when I reveal that I'm American, people are very nice to me. I have a funny story about Denmark, but anyway, so I really highly recommend this book. And I know that I'm not giving you an answer. You said you asked long-winded questions. I give long-winded answers. And I mean, Huntington's basically his solution was that we have to kind of return to like a propositional, the idea of a propositional nation, while at the same time acknowledging that there is an actual like physical historical character to the country, and that to just pretend that there isn't would be bad for everyone, including people who cannot, trace their ancestry back to the Mayflower or whatever. That ignoring who we are and where we came from as Americans is bad for everyone, in fact, not just for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so he tries to do the two things, which is, acknowledge the actual demographic reality of the founding, while at the same time trying to create something like an American creed, which, today is like, will get you laughed at on the right. We talk about propositional nationhood, creeds and things like that. But I mean, what's the alternative to that? Like the ethno state, the completely abstract nation where, we just pretend that it doesn't matter if we have infinity immigration. So
there's a lot there, and I think,
yeah,
no, it's great because it made me think of a lot of different things. So first off, like I'm adding that to my list of books to buy, because I'm writing a duology of pieces on immigration right now, because I've been dealing with a very similar question, and maybe because I'm the type of person, like, where push comes to shove, I'm a rootless cosmopolitan. I've pretty much always lived in urban and diverse areas, and I'm not gonna, because I feel like there is something to be said for like the superficiality of like liberal cosmopolitan like false diversity. I think because I have lived in actual diverse areas, and there is mixing, but like people will find their own rhythms, and like people tend to self-segregate, and I feel like that makes people, particularly white liberals, very uncomfortable. And I think, to me, I will say, like, because minor spoilers, like I see like a dark future and a bright future for America in regards to national identity and like ethnicity, culture, etc. Like, to me, the dark future is we continue down the path that we're on, like having infinite people come in without any attempts at immigration, and continuing with this thermostatic identity politics on both sides of the aisle, because to the chagrin of the right, I see Donald Trump and that modern Republican movement is open white identity politics, which maybe has its thermostatic benefits. That having been said, I feel like long term it's just as poisonous as the left's identity politics is.
Yeah.
That having been said, I do think there is something to the American character that is maybe it's unique, maybe it's American chauvinism to say so, but like, at least for me personally, on my dad's side of the family, I know, like, we go back to like the 1600s. They're like, when I mean, if everybody who said it's not my personal claim, but if everybody said, they came over on the Mayflower, who actually did come over on the Mayflower, it would be like, the size of a carrier jet. That having been said, like, on my dad's side of the family, like, they were like in Appalachia since the 1600s. But on my mom's side of the family, they came over from Ireland in like the early 1900s. And I do think, there was maybe some, like, it was easier for the Irish to integrate at that time. That having been said, like, these weren't like trivial differences at the time. Like you talked about, like, the ethnic versus tribal versus cultural, like, Irish versus Polish versus Jewish, etc. People who we just think of as white now, these were not trivial differences at the time. And I think, like, there's a lot of difference between like somebody from Mexico or Venezuela and like the English settler colonial stock. and you know, uh, there's a lot of distance there, but I don't think there's quite as much distance between the Irish or Polish or German immigrants and like Mexicans or Venezuelans.
Yeah.
Because just anecdotally, and I'm curious to your thoughts on this, and forgive me for my long-winded answer to your long-winded answer to my long-winded question, but like, because I live in I grew up around like a lot of like Hispanic people and Mexicans, and right now where I live, I'm around a lot of people like that, and I work in an industry right now where like I do technical support for these big events, and it's a lot of like it's like mostly white and Hispanic with like a smattering of others, and like to me like white and Hispanic are very, very similar. Like I dated a girl back in the day who, like, her cousin married a Mexican guy. And, first of all, Mexican redneck parties are a lot of fucking fun. But I will say, like, there's a lot that it can still, I think there's a lot, there's less distance there than people make it out to be. And one more thing, and I'll throw it back to you, because, like, my original conversation with Alex Kashuda, to tie it to the original conversation, she talked about how even in Romania, Americanism and American culture, even with all this bullshit that to us feels very pressing and very strongly felt, Americanism and American culture is still something that's aspirational globally. And I still think it is something that can be, it's still a project that can be like assimilated into. I think that there can be a bad ending where, like, I do think, like, I don't know how much we want to get into it here, but like, the dark future of, techno feudalism.
Yeah.
If you read somebody like Varoufakis or Joel Kotkin, we talked about that. There's like, weird ethnic blocks that can exist. And I think like currently Europe is showing a very bad example, but I think America has like the best chance. So I guess what's your thoughts on that, especially because like, somebody who is, of Mexican descent, but, somebody who is on the right. And I feel like we have a lot in common just based on our, our conversation culturally and with our worldviews. So I feel like it's not like an unbridgeable gap. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I think the important thing is that identity is irrepressible. And so this is more something that for people who are on the left or liberal and don't really think about identity at all, or rather they don't think it's important. And it's funny because you'll almost always catch someone who says something like that in some way, honoring some part of their past, whether it's their their heritage on one or other side of the family. Like there's just always something that will kind of betray that you actually do value some form of identity. And so, like I said, on the highest, most abstract level is like nationhood, and which is the one that liberals or people who are on the left. And again, I hate to sound like I'm generalizing, but it's just those are the people who are generally more inclined to say, well, those things don't really matter. And in fact, there was an article in the New York Times a few years ago, and I think it was called like the end of the nation state or something, basically saying, well, the nation state's kind of a new thing and it's not that big of a deal if it goes away. And it's basically like we should just get over it, and like borders are kind of cringe. And it's funny because it's like you don't understand what happens when you do that. When you get rid of a cohesive national identity and just completely throw the idea of like a nation out the window, you're not getting rid of identity. You're not getting rid of something that's divisive. You're getting rid of probably the only thing that could keep people from just spinning off into other more, I guess you could say, primal forms of identity, including
clannishness. Race. Yeah.
Yes. Like it's so funny because it's like they don't see that you're not fixing the problem that you think you're fixing by getting rid of the idea of a national identity. You're actually just going to encourage people to spin off into other forms of it, whether it's like your regional, like people in the South, whether it's racial, whether it's religious, whatever. It's irrepressible. It will always exist. And in fact, if your goal is to avoid people coming to blows or like really hating each other and feeling that they can't live live in the same geographical space, aka a country, then you should actually want something like a cohesive, somewhat cohesive, something like a national identity that keeps us from getting completely at our throats. And so I think that's a really important thing that people take for granted, is the fact that identity is irrepressible, and to some degree, all politics are identity politics. And that can be bad if it's taken to like an extreme. Obviously, if you think like, well, I'm going to vote basically what's best for my particular like ethnic group or whatever, like that's how you get ethnic lobbies and things like that, which I think can be really toxic.
Not good. Yeah.
Right. And so, but also like all politics are identity politics in the sense of like, I'm an American, so like I will vote for what I think is the best for my country, by which I mean the people that share this nation with me and who I also hope the best for. And that's probably the best expression of national identity, right? Is caring about people who you've never met because they're American.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because when you go abroad, I think that this becomes more real in the sense, like when I didn't do it this trip, but sometimes when I go, my wife is German. When I go abroad, like I hear it, if I hear an American, everyone's speaking German or whatever, and I hear an American, I'm like, it makes me happy. I don't know who that person is. I just hear them speaking English, and I immediately know that they're an American, and it's like we have something in common, and I don't know, and it wouldn't be possible if I didn't think of myself as as like a proud American despite everything. That's so I think there's this idea that if you're not like towing the party line on the right, then you're like becoming like an unpatriotic leftist. It's so stupid. Patriotism is not something that belongs to one party or another. I don't care what anyone says.
I agree.
And by the way, you're an Ellis Islander. According to some people on the
I was gonna say I only
you're-
laughed just a second ago because you probably saw that dumb chart that went around recently, like of like the tiers. I am.
Yeah.
Well, I think I technically average out to B stock because my dad's side of the family is A stock, but my mother's side of the family, we're this is a family show, so I won't say the actual word, but like the Irish at the time were called like, the what do we say? The urban individual of Europe, the N-words of Europe is what, they used to call the Irish. So
Irish.
Yeah, exactly. I average out to B tier because to me, like that's so silly. And I feel like
it is.
That's one of the
infuriating.
things. Well, because to me, like, again, no, you're right. I think you're right to be infuriated because I think I don't want to pick on her because I mentioned her a second ago. Like, I found myself very frustrated with the interview with this woman, Crystal Ball, where like she was confronted with the question of, like you said, like, well, what are you doing about the fact, you being, the royal you of the Democrats, of the fact that young men and across ethnic bounds have shifted to the right. She's like, well, I think the important thing is like humanity in general. And it's very wishy-washy, at least to me. That was very frustrating about the left, is like, just like vague humanism, that's not a knife that cuts anymore. I mean, especially if, I don't know how much this is something that you've studied, being more on the right. I wouldn't be surprised if you have, because you seem to be a well-read individual, but pretty much every like leftist regime or government abandoned this vague notion of like humanism and the Internationale for nationalism when they actually needed to consolidate power. So I think, right now, like the United States is like 60% white. So already that's a non-starter because like the ones who would actually be on board for like white ethno state, even if it were possible, or a minority of a plurality. So that's not possible. That having been said, I do think that there is something there. And this is maybe a strange example, because I will say, like, to cite two books, like I think you were right. There's a really interesting book I read recently called The Return of the Strong Gods by R.R. Reno, who talks about basically what you said, that this kind of like, who it sounds like that Hudson talked about as well, like identity is not superfluous. Like even like, my grandpa who came over from, he was like second or third generation Irish. It was important to him throughout his life. To me, I feel like Hispanic Americans, like it seems like Irish or Polish, whatever. At least that's been my experience growing up in these spaces. That having been said, like the balkanization, and that, we use the term balkanization as shorthand for fractional and factional politics, but those were extremely violent race wars. So we don't want that to happen.
Yeah.
But that having been said, I do think that like, and I hope there can be some sort of reconstitution to a greater identity, because the other thing I was going to reference is I'm almost done right now. There's a book called The Invention of the Jewish People by an author called Shlomo Sand, who's a Israeli historian who, and I understand he was controversial to some like Israelis, where he talks about like, again, like as you can imagine, the invention of the Jewish people who, I don't want to give away the whole book, but he talks about like the difference between like the ancient Bronze Age Hebrews versus the like the post-exile and like first to like third, second to third century Jews versus like, the diaspora in Europe and the Middle East and all these different places, and how there was this conscious effort to create a Jewish identity from all these disparate parts that like, and like if you're, because if you want to be like the leftist materialist version, like the idea that like a Jewish person living in the Levant and the Bronze Age, or somebody who is living in the the second century in Alexandria versus somebody who's living in Poland in the 1500s. The idea that these people have really anything to do with each other other than religiously is kind of silly. But the Israeli project, and I don't want to dig too deep into this because this is obviously a spicy topic, but I think you'll get what I mean, was like, let's have a conscious identity from these disparate parts. Even if it is not literally true, there is a spiritual and emotional truth that is aspirational. And I think that's kind of, maybe much to the chagrin of my friends on the left and the right, like to me, the path forward is like a civic nationalism that is multiracial, but like an understanding like this is a culture that we are assimilating into. Because you're somebody who is of Mexican descent, you talk about hearing an American who could be of any ethnic extraction and feeling some sort of kinship. And at least for me personally, I grew up in Canada and I moved to the US when I was 10 or 12, but like it's kind of like the examples I'll give, it's like either like because you live in the Midwest now, like I will talk mad shit about Ohio, but if I hear somebody else from say New York talking shit about Ohio, I will die for Ohio. Much in the same way, like if somebody talks shit about I will talk shit about my sister all day, but if somebody says anything even remotely bad about my sister, it's fisticuffs. So I hope that that's something that we can recapture. And I don't think it's a given, but I think America has a pretty good chance.
Yeah,
if we work hard.
It helps that America's so big and kind of crazy that it makes it really hard for us to have a civil war, or rather another one. And yeah, it is hard to sort of put your finger on what it means to be an American, especially today. And it is interesting that both the left and the right are kind of trying to pull that apart. And everyone is basically in the business of creating a new national identity. And I've written about this a few years ago, that the problem, or rather the challenge that nationalists faced in the United States is that they were attempting to actually create something rather than salvage something. And which is to say that I think that this is to some degree true for a lot of nationalist movements, if not all of them, that they are often defending a past and invoking the past, but they're also actually trying to create something new. And they will often frame it as revival, rebirth, renaissance, whatever, but it is always something new that they're typically trying to create. That's obviously in their minds, honoring the past. What is something? Someone said that tradition is not like something about tradition is not worshiping the ashes, but like kindling the fire or something like that. I think that's basically true for nationalist movements. Yes, they're in their minds, they are honoring the past, but they're also actually engaged in the process of creating something new. And but it is, I think, hard to sort of put your finger on what it is to be an American, or rather, it's hard to sort of outline those things in a kind of systematic way, but you feel it. And there was a story actually when I was in Germany for all of last month, visiting my in-laws, and there was a story about a 21-year-old American kid on a train in Dresden, and he saw this German girl being accosted by a bunch of migrants. And this is just like, this is factually correct. Like this was reported in German media, because a couple of them got caught. But so he like, and remember the trains have, he's not the only person on the train. So other people could have done this, but this is actually very common in Germany. My wife like hates this about Germany. And I guess if you live in New York, maybe this is kind of familiar, but it's very common for when this sort of thing happens. German men apparently are very notoriously like, don't do anything. It's like they just look the other way. And I don't know if it's like a cultural thing or whatever. Anyways, it's extremely common and pisses my wife off. So anyways, the 21-year-old American steps in and like, makes the group of guys go away, and they come back with a knife and they slash his face. But he protects the girl. And there was another story a few years ago about a couple of Americans on a train in France, and a guy armed with like a machine gun and a bunch of other weapons. It was a terrorist attack on a train. He started shooting at people. I don't think anyone died because two Americans who were on the train jumped him right away. And like, this is actually like, I will every so often hear about these stories about Americans in Europe doing things like this when other people are kind of standing around or being afraid. And this sounds so like stupidly like chest beating, chauvinistic and patriotic, but it's like, whenever I see those stories, I'm like, yeah, of course it was. Of course it was of course it was an American. Of course it was an American 21-year-old on a train who, stepped up. And I don't know, there's something about that it like makes my my patriotism tingle, that Americans are kind of like, we still have that thing to us that we're, I don't know.
There's still a there.
Yes. Yeah. It's really hard for me to put it into words, but I'm not crazy because my wife says this too. She,
for better or for worse, we're like that.
Yeah. Right. We're the ones that are willing to kind of step in it for better or worse. And it makes me proud. And that's why I really don't like, I used to partake in the dooming, and I hate it now because I just think it's very lame and pessimistic and weak, and I don't know. I don't really have a stomach for it anymore, especially when I hear stories like that seem to be tailor made to make me remember that I'm very patriotic. So, anyways, I don't know if it's a good anecdote, but
I think it's a good anecdote.
It helps being abroad. I think this is completely true. Being abroad makes you appreciate being an American. And that's not to say that like I hate Europe, and I actually love Germany, and I love visiting Europe every time we go. And I wouldn't mind living there for a while with my wife and my kids so they can grow up with my in-laws. But it also reminds me of what I like about America and Americans when I'm over there. And I think that's just the distance, makes the heart grow fonder. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's understandable. And I'll give one more anecdote, and because I know we're coming to the end of our time, and I want to respect your time. But I think once again, it makes me think of, I mentioned, several times, like when we were talking, Alex Kashuda said, like, there's still a cachet to Americanism and American identity, and for better or for worse, I think it's still the leader of the Western world to the degree that that's an entity. And the at least one thing it makes me think of is like, when I grew up in, my parents are American, but we grew up in Canada, and it was where like my dad would talk about how like Canadians would talk shit and be like, oh well, America's doing this bad thing, America's doing that bad thing. And then when like, something else bad was happening in the world, like, well, why didn't America act to do something about that? America should do something.
Yeah.
So I think there's still something there, and I think it's still something salvageable. What it's going to look like, I don't think it's a given, but I think there's still a there, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. But in any case,
Yeah.
Pedro, I really appreciate you coming on. I don't want to take up too much more of your time.
That's fine, man.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. I feel like we could talk for another 2 hours. I'd be happy to talk again one of these times. But like I said, I want to respect your time. So I want to ask you, like, do you have any plugs and promotions, like anything coming up, or you just want to plug your work more generally?
Yeah. Well, really quick, have you seen the movie Golden Child?
No, I haven't.
Okay, with Eddie Murphy. You should watch it. It's a classic. But there's this line in that movie that it always just randomly it'll come back to me. And this movie is from the 80s, I think. It's like 84, 86. And Eddie Murphy plays this American. I think he's either a PI or a cop. And he has to basically stop the world from ending. And to do so, he's like swept up in this plot that involves Tibetan monks and demons and a child who's like a Buddha that can save the world. But
On my
he has
list
to go,
now. Sounds
right,
amazing.
dragons, and he has to go abroad to do it. And there's this like little crusty monk who it kind of is like his Sherpa, his spiritual Sherpa, and he's like really rude and gross, but he's very wise at the same time and endearing. And at one point, he tells this woman who's like conflicted, because she's drawn to the brash, bold American Eddie Murphy, who's like, shooting from the hip to save the world. And the little monk guy says something like, "Those magnificent Americans, they have so much power and so little understanding of what to do." And I don't know why, but that line has been seared into my brain since I saw the movie. Because when he says it, he's like, it's very clear that he feels like a lot of affection for Eddie Murphy because his character is, very brave. But then there's also kind of like he's like chuckling to himself about like, all these crazy Americans, like they're cowboys, but they don't really know, what to do with all that cowboy. And I don't know. I think you're right. I think cachet is actually such a great way to put it, because it is so hard to actually, define these things in a systematic, specific way, in an ideological way, because these things are often things that defy ideology and like categorization in that sense. Like you're like naming the anatomy of like of an animal or something like that. But yeah, I'm actually, although if you've followed me for years, you know that I was a pretty much a doomer and all that in the past. I'm actually like you. I'm optimistic because I think that despite everything, Americans are still good. There's still good people who are capable of good, and that's also why the political situation is so frustrating for me on like the extremes of the left and right, is because I think Americans are good, and they deserve good things, and yeah, and that for that reason, I'm optimistic that despite everything, despite how bad things are, somehow we're going to figure it out.
Well, it's funny. I usually ask at the end of every podcast, because like you, I tend to be a doomer and a doom and gloom kind of guy. What's something that makes you feel optimistic and hopeful for the future? But I think that's a really great answer right there.
I think, yeah, I don't know. It's my sense that I guess it's just touching grass, you could say, and getting out there, and like a combination of going abroad and being reminded of, like, why I actually still am very patriotic. And then also just the people I meet, my neighbors. I live in a very pro-Trump town. My neighbors fly Trump flags, and they are like, my mind is pretty well compartmentalized, where like I don't allow things that happen online to like make me seethe at people in real life. But if my mind wasn't compartmentalized, I would probably, hate my neighbors because I would assume that they hate me, right?
Mhm.
But my like Trump loving neighbors are some of the nicest, most considerate, thoughtful people I have ever met. And they don't have a lot, but they're always so generous and so helpful. And
Mhm.
like my daughter um got really sick one time, and an ambulance got called to our house, and I remember carrying her out the steps to my front door, and everything happened so fast. And my neighbor from like two houses over was on my front lawn asking me, is there anything I can do? Like, do you want me to stay with like your wife while you're at the hospital?
Mhm.
And it's that kind of stuff that is like, it makes me optimistic, or to think that despite like all the stupid shit that happens online and even in Washington, like Americans are still fundamentally decent, and they can still be neighbors.
Mhm. Well, I think that's a really beautiful sentiment, and not to add on and make it too much longer, but it's funny how I've had a similar experience from the opposite side, where like I live in a mostly Hispanic area. I work with mostly Hispanic people, and they're good, like nice, kind people who like the same shit that like the white people I grew up with liked, and I
Yeah.
bonded with a guy over Rammstein, and there's differences there as well. But I do think that like overall, there's it's cliche to say there's a lot more similarities than there are differences. There's problems to work through, and not everything is going to be compressed into a monoculture. And I think that's okay, because I think like there is still a there, but no, I think that's a really beautiful sentiment, and I think that maybe we need to be okay with being hard on our sleeve a little bit more, and a little bit
Yes.
dare I say it, corny, because I think that's
Oh
what
yeah.
got us to where we are, and that's what people like about America to begin with.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I hate the anti corn, like basically if you express yourself in a way that could be remotely sentimental, then it's like corny and cringe. And I don't know how I actually don't know how this happened, but I hate it. Um, it's really terrible, and it
Mhm.
results in, I think, a lot of social dysfunction when you
Yeah.
suddenly decide that you can't talk about how you actually feel about something. It's weird. It's like
Yeah,
I
I
really,
think getting older and having kids in your life really changes your perspective. And I think we're at a similar age and place in our
yeah,
life where like, I don't have the stomach for the black pilling and stuff anymore. Cause like,
yeah,
it's easier when you're young and you don't have family and kids in your life. You're like, yeah, you know what, fuck it, black pill everything. Billions must die. I was like, okay. Which is again something I said with Alex Kashuda. Like she was like, yeah, I have kids, like, especially because her being Romania and living through like communist revolutions. Like, yeah,
yeah,
revolutions are pretty violent and not great for
yeah,
most people.
yeah,
So
yeah.
there's still we're sounds like you're a history buff too. Like we're nowhere even like approaching like
No,
pre-communist or pre-fascist conditions. Like we're nowhere even like near like Jim Crow levels of racial tension or like the late 1960s. Like we still have a lot to work with. So I don't know.
yeah,
But
yeah.
anyway, Pedro, I really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to do any plugs,
Oh yeah,
promotions,
yeah.
or
Sorry, I should do that.
no?
Well,
That's okay.
you can read me at Read Contra, like the video game, readcontra.com. That's my Substack, and that's where I generally do a lot of stuff, including my own podcast. You should come on my podcast.
I would be happy to.
Cool. Well, then you can listen to him on my podcast at readcontra.com.
Okay. Well, Pedro, this has been a pleasure, and I really appreciate your conversation. This is I'm happy to talk again with these things.
Amen. Thank you.
All right, take it easy.
Bye.